Thank you very much for having me here this evening at this inaugural lecture. And I have to say that the University of Reading has done a remarkable communications job. I attend events across the country. I tend to do one event outside London a week. Rarely do I get national coverage of those kind of events. So hands up to the comms team, because I think that the commitment of which you've put into this series of events and this inaugural event is a testament to the cultural commitment that this university makes to this issue. It is not something that has just been confined to the Lgbt network group to kind of string along on a budget of £5 for biscuits. It's something that's owned by the whole institution. I don't speak with notes, which is an absolute nightmare to my communications team, which I get away with when things aren't live streamed, but when they are, it causes a few problems the next day when they say, WTF, I can't believe you said that. But it also means I can't give you a lot of warning about a content note. I know that in lectures these days it's useful to give an indication as to what I might say, but as I don't entirely know what I'm going to say yet, I can't give you an entirely thorough content note. But we will be looking at the past, and some of that past is murky and dark, and some of the things experienced by lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people in the past is something that leaves a lasting legacy on our communities today, and it bears considering and reflecting on. Some of the work that's happening today is in response to some of that legacy that still remains in our major institutions and in societal attitudes. And some of the things and challenges going forward is about remaining conscious and mindful of some of the challenges that remain in some of our communities. So I can't guarantee a barrel of laughs in the next 40 minutes, but I will certainly attempt to be comprehensive in where I think things are happening. I think the other thing I would also disclaim before I begin is I've worked at Stonewall since 2005. I started as a baby dyke with a number 3 haircut, baggy jeans and 20 Marlboro Lights in an organisation that was small, 25 staff, 1.2 million turnover, which is pretty small for a charity. Stonewall at that stage established that we would never take core government funding. It was a principle that was easy to adopt because it was never on offer. 12 years on, we maintain that principle, which I am slightly regretting, but we are now 120 staff and our turnover is 7 million. And I don't share that as a means of kind of showing off about that, although there's a little bit of pride there, obviously, but it's an indication of quite the demand for our work and the way in which people are willing to spend money on enabling Stonewall to help them. We believe the value of our work should be paid for. I think there's a lot of charitable work that's done in this country for free to institutions and organisations that should be paying. 10% of the population is LGBT, they pay taxes. If local authorities need help learning how to spell lesbian, they should pay us for that. That's fine. So we're very proud of the mixture of models we adopt in order to achieve acceptance without exception. But the perceptions that I'm going to share with you today are to a certain extent personal. There is an objective analysis of what I think has happened, but I cannot help but see things through the eyes of my own experiences. And Stonewall is a particular type of organisation and has been part of this journey in a particular way that I will attempt to articulate. So when I came out in 1993, I was 13 years old. I came out in a school in the midst of Section 28, and my only solace was the well of loneliness, Orange is not the only fruit, and Beth Jordache on Brookside. Now, any of you who are old enough to remember those things, Beth Jordache on Brookside was hot as, but did kill her father, which was an unfortunate development point for me. And The Well of Loneliness is the single most depressing book in the history of books. So when you are 13 and working out your sexuality as a practicing Catholic, which I still am, in a small Welsh community, The Well of Loneliness is not the most inspiring book. And Orange is not the only fruit is not the most helpful guide to how to get a girlfriend and keep one. But that withstanding, I still managed to somehow find my way, and that is also inevitably shaping my experience. And I share that because I think it's important to acknowledge that as someone who's 37, there are only things I can understand about our past that I learn from the conversations I have with LGBT people and from the histories. But I would only ever know my own experience. And I think that that's an important factor to acknowledge as part of the LGBT journey. We talk about an LGBT community and an LGBT experience, as if that's a monolithic, universal experience. And actually, ethnicity, gender, class, age, all those create subsections of communities where there are very different experiences. And I will try to reflect that as much as possible. But the experiences of gay men or men who had sex with men 65, 70 years ago were not the same as the experiences of me as a baby dyke at 13. And we have to bear that in mind. But we create and are bunged together as this one monolithic LGBT community and pretend we have shared experiences. So let's look at Stonewall's founding. Stonewall was founded in 1989 in response to something called Section 28. And Section 28 was a piece of legislation that prevented the promotion of homosexuality in schools. It was prompted by a book of dubious quality called Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin, and after 30 pages of interminably dull, boring stories, Jenny, who lives with her dad Eric and his boyfriend Martin, is seen doing what we call in Wales having a morning cwtch, that is having a cup of tea with Eric and Martin, and Eric and Martin have only got their pyjama bottoms on, and this was considered to be such a dangerous image that was likely to convert an entire generation of young people to become rampant homosexuals. The conclusion was to ban that book. Now, despite the fact that I was brought up on Cinderella, I managed, despite that, to come out as a lesbian, but it was a real anxiety at the time, and I think we've got to remember where that anxiety was coming from. So 60 years ago, we had a generation of men who were told that they were completely and utterly to be rejected by society. They were actively persecuted by police. They were told that everything they were was wrong and something to be ashamed of. And the Wolfenden report was revolutionary, but took an incredible long time to be implemented. It took a decade before there was any real understanding or acceptance of some of those recommendations. Gay men were vilified and persecuted by the police and actively persecuted by the authorities. It was an utter source of shame and anxiety to let anyone know that you might be homosexual. Women didn't get a look in, really. Women were considered dangerous if they had same-sex attraction. They were considered mad, they were considered mentally ill, and not part of any of the discourse. But invisibility is almost damaging in a way when you see gay men being actively persecuted. That creates a culture of fear. Trans people, if they had the means and the availability of access to resources, were able to fully transition, but only if they had a privileged enough background to do so. The state wasn't overly concerned about them. But if you're from a low-income background, if you weren't exposed to different ideas, transitioning was an absolute impossibility, and it became fetishised. You could dress up as the opposite gender, but there's no way you could live as you wanted to live. So that's quite a complex combination of different identities that were going on. And during the 70s, some of that loosened and relaxed, but of course what happened in the 80s was HIV. And HIV basically decimated a community. And the state, the NHS, public services, absolutely failed to respond to that epidemic that was affecting our community. And it relied on LGBT people to come together and support each other. And lesbians were running the buddying systems and the voluntary systems and the free meals and the meals on wheels, and people were dying. Men were dying. And the state's response to that was to ban children's books, to stop these issues being talked about in schools, and to tell the nation that HIV was caused by gay men. That is quite a heavy legacy when we had barely recovered as a community from being told we were completely unlawful, that we were illegal. And that's not that long ago. So Stonewall was set up by Sir Ian McKellen, so who's Richard III or Gandalf or Magento, whatever cultural reference point you're going for, and a group of men and a group of women to set up a highly strategic lobbying group. And Stonewall was pragmatic, and is pragmatic, non-democratic, highly strategic, and works on the basis that we will work with anyone to gain cross-party, cross-organisational, cross-collaborative support to achieve acceptance for LGBT people. In those days it was L&G, B barely got a look in, and What lesbian and gay people were about, and what Stonewall was about, was a studious agenda of assimilation. And what Stonewall did was do everything they could to gain cross-party support, to have a catalogue of legal equalities introduced for lesbian and gay people. And it started with Section 28. But the legal catalogue, and you'll see this on your posters, and you'll have had a good session cataloguing all those legal changes, actually took quite a long time to come in. Angela Mason had to work extremely hard in extremely hostile circumstances. But there's a really good footage, for those of you who know your queer history, Queer as Folk came out. So the first 10 minutes of Queer as Folk shows an underage man having sex with an older man. And it was incredibly powerful as a series. It was amazing to watch as a teenager. And Angela Mason went on television condemning it, because it came at the same time that Stonewall was pushing through equal age of consent in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And the thought that there could be this throwaway moment on television of an older man with a younger man was so dangerous to the campaign that was happening. Stonewall had to condemn it. And now we're more laid back and it's all wonderful, but I can see why there was that anxiety at that time. John Major said he would introduce every single legislative change for lesbian and gay people. He then got kicked out, Tony Blair came in, but it actually took until 2004 to be given legislation where you couldn't be fired from your job for being LGBT. It took a long time. 2004 was a major milestone. Civil Partnership Act, Gender Recognition Act. So Stonewall had been set up and Press for Change had been set up in a similar spirit. And what you had in those two pieces of legislation was very complicit, very courteous, very polite legislation. The Civil Partnership Act acknowledged that same-sex couples existed, but absolutely understood that we couldn't be part of the same institution, but thank you very much for the opportunity. The Gender Recognition Act enabled people to transition if they were good enough, if they were trans enough, if they'd had a diagnosis, and if they'd lived in role, and if they'd jumped through all the hoops required by people who were not trans, and we were very grateful for the opportunity. These two bits of legislation were very, very significant in the journey. But we have to remember the legacy of what was happening. A generation of men who were told they were completely unlawful, a generation of men who were dying, and then my generation who were told that sexual orientation was pretend, relationships were pretend, and it was something we could never talk about. Now, one doesn't require a heavy insight into psychotherapy, psychology, to realise that that generational trauma was going to remain. And no EU legislation enabled us not to possibly be fired in our jobs if people found out we might be gay, wasn't going to eradicate those 3 generations of pain and hurt. But almost from 2004 to 2014, where we got marriage, what Stonewall did was campaign solidly for very good, solid legislation. And we did that, and I was part of that, though I was more junior. We did that through an assimilationist agenda. We talked about the good gay. And the good gay was someone who was very, very easy to get on with, not too political, worked hard, just wanted to get married, possibly have children through fostering or adoption because single parents couldn't be relied upon. Good gay. Good gay. Non-complicated lives. Non-messed up narratives. Really nice, simple, good gay. Lesbians weren't too butch, gay men weren't too camp. And that way we created a narrative about LGBT people, but it was lesbian and gay people, being just like straight people. And thus brought a whole generation of parliamentarians close and slowly with us, because they could see the possibility that their son could be like that, and they wanted them to be a good gay, not too political, not too camp. Now, Britain has the single best legislation for LGBT people in the world, including a pretty magical bit of legislation called the Human Fertilisation Embryology Act that enables same-sex parents who are lesbians for the non-birth mother to get immediate parental rights over the child from the moment of conception. Because what we were finding is that going through a process of adoption, and if a mother died in childbirth, the non-birth mother would lose custody of that child. We got that through because you had a lesbian in the Public Affairs Department and a House of Lords who had no clue what we were doing at all. So even when I was doing the work in 2008, we were getting stuff through because as long as we talked about removing the need for a father on a birth certificate, everyone was quite happy. We only got away with some of the more radical stuff because nobody was looking. Well, we had to maintain a very clean narrative. And if I look at some of the posters we produced in those days for schools, very clean. So our different families posters only ever has 2 parents. Might have 2 women, 2 men. You never have 3. Or anything complicated like a donor who might pick them up on a Saturday, and 2 mums who then split up and there's another woman in and 4. Actually, the reality is that families are complicated. And the reality in primary schools is that different families means a whole smorgasbord of stuff. But not for us. We were very clean, very sensible, very good gays. So a non-EU funded PhD will eventually explore whether that was the right thing or not. But what I was concerned about as someone who is, often patronised by people who want to mentor me, telling me to wear brooches, and generally buy a tie when someone tells me to accessorise, I was attempting to fit into that good gay narrative. The blouses and the slightly softer hair and the thank you very much. And it didn't suit me. It was deeply uncomfortable. So what I was aware of at Stonewall was a contradiction, a fundamental contradiction at the heart of what we were about. We were saying that being open, being yourselves, being able to be yourself was fundamental to mental health and well-being, that secrets are toxic, that keeping something in is shameful, but at the same time perpetuating the notion that being gay had to be something very simple and easy to understand. So after a decade when I took over as chief executive, having held 7 different positions as Stonewall got bigger, I was absolutely determined post-marriage that Stonewall should instead reflect a very different LGBT communities and that we should find a way to amplify the experiences of different LGBT people. Because what we were aware of, marriage came out of nowhere. Marriage was a slightly unexpected bit of legislation, and it was a result of a coalition government. But it was the first piece of legislation that didn't come from grassroots. Every other bit of legislation had come from the LGBT communities. Marriage suddenly came out of here. We weren't quite ready for it. And what it revealed was a really uncomfortable alliance of this so-called tolerance of LGBT people that kind of extended to LNG people, but not so much to those who are a bit different and a bit other in that narrative. It was a real eye-opener for us. But during that decade of legal change, as has been outlined, Stonewall conducted a huge amount of research about what's happening in schools. We worked with employers, 750 employers now work with Stonewall. We work with 2,000 schools. We are making these massive inroads because we wear the suits and we're polite and we're courteous. But we now have a responsibility to, now we're in there, to just slightly push it in a different direction. And my responsibility, as someone who spends a lot of time with organisations who hate LGBT people, is to really show that actually there's LGBT people everywhere, in all shapes and sizes, from all communities, doing all sorts of things. And when the Archbishop of Canterbury says to me, I have no gay staff, and I say, yes, you do. Working with these new communities, really trying to go much deeper and build bridges, not walls, but do it in a way that acknowledges the full diversity, complexity, beauty of our LGBT communities. Because what we're finding, after a decade of interventions in schools, for example, is that if you are white, middle class, a good gay, you're probably not experiencing bullying anymore. But if you're from an ethnic minority background, or you receive free school meals, or you're disabled, or you're trans, your suicidal ideation is much higher, your attempted suicide is much higher, your bullying is much higher, your truancy is much higher, your ability to engage and participate in society is much more complicated. So I have to consider, my responsibility is how do we take the machine that is Stonewall and start supporting those communities. And trans was the beginning of that for Stonewall. Trans was saying, look, Stonewall has done a disservice. When you got the Gender Recognition Act and we got the Civil Partnership Act, as we kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, we should have brought trans in there. And instead we said, we respect your autonomy to represent yourself with 2p. And we might have £200 to every penny you've got, but you do it your way. And Stonewall had to say, we're really sorry, we didn't do that well. Do you want to be part, or do you want me to help you to build something yourself? How do you want to do this? And Stonewall has had to give up power. And the fundamental element of any transformative agenda is about giving up power. And Stonewall has to give up some of our brand, and Stonewall has to give up some of our tight control over our top 10 tips. So a manifesto for trans inclusion written by 16 members of a trans community, where Stonewall would have normally done that on an A5 bit of card on 3 tweetable BuzzFeed images, needs to be longer, needs to be more complicated, needs to reflect the complexity of some of the issues that are going on. And we need to face into the fact that some members of our LGBT community don't believe that trans people have a role in that. And we have to face into the fact that racism on the gay community is rife. And an 18-year-old black boy going on to Grindr sees no blacks as soon as he logs on. And that gay clubs aren't accessible to disabled people. And that there is racism and discrimination and prejudice against all our communities. And that actually gay men and lesbians aren't always best of friends. And I have to experience misogyny as part of my job. And I have to experience hostility as part of my job. And we have to face into some of that stuff. And that means when we're talking to the institutions, we say, well, actually, let's talk about your bisexual staff. We're thrilled that you've got a gay one, and he's really happy, and he really likes working here, and he gets on really well with the girls of the organisation. But can we actually talk about your bisexual members of staff who might be in opposite sex relationships who don't feel able to tell you about that? We have to talk about what we genuinely mean by authenticity, and how we can find space to be ourselves wherever we live, work, socialise, play and pray. And that's what Stonewall's issue is about now. And if I look at what the future of LGBT equality looks like, it's about us looking beyond our peripheral vision. We've had a situation and a movement that has created, to a certain extent, a selfish movement. We are preoccupied with ourselves. Now, if I had an afternoon, we would talk about neoliberalism and capitalism and all that, but we won't. But we have created a movement where we're concerned about ourselves. Can I get married? Can I pay my taxes? When I dissolve my civil partnership, will I get a good settlement? We're not very good at going, so how are you? And for me, the challenge is where we have a huge number of active supporters. How do I get them to care about Muslim lesbians living in Yorkshire who may not get 5 GCSEs, who may work in Poundland and have no prospect of coming out? How do I get one of the most effective social movements in this country, one of the biggest social movements in this country, a social movement that strikes fear into politicians, forcing Tim Farron to fall over himself when he talks about gay sex, and Theresa May to fall over herself when she talks about gay sex, and Corbyn, they all just worry so much. Like, that's quite a powerful influence we've got there. How do we garner that power to make sure they give a damn about the non-binary kid who's finding their way at school and doesn't quite know what uniform they want to wear? How do we garner that power? And that's quite a challenge for a social movement. And as Stonewall moves increasingly to understand our responsibilities internationally, how do we find a new way of doing that too? So we get a lot of requests from organisations who want us to share what we've learned with international LGBT groups. And Stonewall doesn't copyright anything, you can have everything, that's fine. But how do we resist the temptation to be imperialistic, white explainers in that context? And how do we persuade our supporters in Britain to not boycott Russian vodka that's made in Latvia, but maybe find a different strategic response that supports the LGBT groups in Russia to garner their own response? How do we persuade Barclays, who's one of our key contacts and clients, to use their influence in Uganda to try and change that law? How do we get EY, who's got a big operation base in Northern Ireland, to talk to Stonewall? How do we get all these different organisations that we're working with to think a bit differently and work a bit differently and resist the temptation to set an agenda that is the most attractive, politically popular way of doing things? Boycotts, petitions, surveys, marches, when actually what's needed is for us to shut up and back off sometimes. Understanding our power as a movement is incredibly important. And I think that means that we all need to take a little bit of time to be a bit kinder to each other. I think we need to have what we call in Stonewall kind eyes as our community changes and develops and evolves, and help each other to be good allies to each other moving forward. That means taking time to understand the emerging identities that are happening in some of our young communities. That means taking time to understand what it's like to be an older lesbian where you have always been put second in an LGBT agenda that has been preoccupied by gay men, and now it feels like all we're talking about is trans. Where is that voice there? How do we manage that? How do we build bridges, not walls? And for Stonewall, we see that responsibility we take that responsibility incredibly seriously. And it means making sure that we create those spaces to have those conversations and share that power. But we are also mindful of the fact that Trump has just signed an executive order that has enshrined the fact that religious communities can discriminate against LGBT communities at will. We have gay men who are being rounded up, and the leader of Chechnya has indicated that he intends every gay man to be exterminated by the 26th of May, where the only hope for those Chechen men is Russia. You know, how are we going to use our power as an international player and as a domestic player? How are we going to use our influence? I have no idea what's going to happen in the next few weeks in terms of politics, but it seems like we're going in a pretty fixed direction. And there are many reasons why people voted for Brexit, and I am not about to be trite about that, but it has certainly triggered something in our nation. And it's prompted in the diversity world a bit of an existential crisis. We've had a decade of equality law, and the premise of equality law is to achieve good relationships between communities. I think Brexit's a pretty good indication we fundamentally failed against that objective. We know that diversity training doesn't really work. We know that telling people to be nice to people doesn't really work. We know that unconscious bias training that costs a huge amount of money and they will be trying selling it to you doesn't work, don't buy it. We know that only by empowering individuals to play a different role in their world and their communities can we hope to achieve change. And as we see more challenges to the concept of living with otherness and with difference, more challenges to that way of life, a greater rejection of immigration and those who are other, we have to start thinking differently about our responsibility to build a better world. And the Equality Act isn't going to be the lever to do that. We all have the power to do that. And so one of the things we're trying to do at Stonewall is give away our content, let local groups deliver the training to schools, generate the income for themselves, design and develop an intervention locally that suits them. We're trying to give stuff away as much as possible. That means a new way of thinking about politics, a new way of thinking about power. And that's not particularly easy. That comes with challenges. But the key is how can we all use our power differently? And so the future of the LGBT movement is each and every one of us understanding that we have a responsibility to not only show up as advocates for the individual who has less power than you, but to actively go and find them and champion them. Mentoring programs is the big thing. I think it's nonsense. You know, I can be patronised by people as much as they like to patronise me, and I am frequently. But I take my power very seriously. And if I can find 3 people who have less power than me, give them access to my office, give them access to the speaker events I go to, let them come along to the meeting with the minister, give them access to things, to see things differently, we might start changing the world a little bit. And by virtue of you being in this room, you have more power. You have been able to come to an event in the University of Reading, to sit here this evening and participate in this process. There will be 3 people where you live, work, socialise, play or pray, who may well identify as LGBT or just don't know yet, who do not have the confidence, the space, the means, the courage, the ability, the language to participate in something like this. So the future of the LGBT movement relies on us to stop being complacent. Marriage does not mean that we are now all happy chappy gays who have a wonderful community. Hate crime is as high as it has ever been. And we cannot just reassure ourselves that legal changes has meant that that work is complete. So stop being complacent. Number 2, take responsibility for your own agency and power and find ways to extend that power to other people. And number 3, recognise that the more we understand about each other and otherness, the more liberating and empowering it is for everybody. The agenda of LGBT enables us to see these things in a particular way. That is gold dust to someone with mental health issues. Someone who's unable to disclose their bipolar has a lot to learn from the gay man who's been struggling to tell his manager he's gay. Let's learn from each other. Let's also make sure that as gay men, we challenge sexism when we see it. Let's make sure as LGBT communities, we are actively challenging racism. Let's make sure that we are actively thinking beyond our peripheral vision about what our communities can achieve. Because that's where you achieve a massive power block. And that's where society can change and influences can change. And I promise you, for everybody who tells me they're woke and they've got it and they're all over the LGBT agenda, I have conversations who are very much not. And they're scared and they're anxious and they don't want their kids to be hurt and they don't want their kids to be LGBT and they don't want these things to be happening. We have plenty to do to make sure that we live in a world where everybody is able to be themselves and find their way without the vulnerability. And those decades of trauma levied against the LGBT community will not dissipate because we can now get married. That trauma remains. And that's about shame, and it's about anxiety, about being different, and the level of integrity that is required to say, I will risk being rejected by my friends, my family, my employer, my priest, my God, my faith, because to not be myself is unthinkable. The level of integrity that requires is absolute pure gold. And if you can help people see the benefits of tapping into that integrity, the more we can make the world a better place. And that does sound trite, but I think it's very important that LGBT people start playing an active role in how we can enable communities to be themselves. So the work of University of Reading is important. Taking these steps, putting the postcards on your doors, indicating that you are a welcoming and inclusive environment, actively saying, I am a welcoming and inclusive person. My priest saying, some of our congregation are LGBT, is very, very, very powerful. He doesn't have to say, I believe that Ruth should have the right to access the institution of marriage within the Catholic Church. I don't mind. He's on his own journey about that. Catholics have got enough to sort out. In recognising that LGBT people exist is the single most affirming thing that can happen in that space. Don't underestimate your individual power to transform situations, organisations and individuals. Thank you very much.
I think the prolonged applause says it all. That was absolutely terrific, Ruth. Thank you very much. A lot there for us to consider, to reflect on, and I'm sure to question and quiz if you're up for that.
Of course.
For a little while. We're going to have some microphones available, and if you'd like to ask a question, please indicate, and would you just mind waiting until the microphone comes so that everyone can see you. But perhaps just as you're thinking about the questions, maybe I'll take the privilege of asking one. You were, I think, absolutely right not to try to over-interpret what happened last June in the Brexit vote, because I think there's too many people trying to do that. But you did make a point about some of the attitudes, some of the behaviour, some of what's happened since. Has that really made you question some of the progress that you thought had been made in terms of wider societal attitudes over the previous, say, couple of decades?
Yeah, it has, and in a way that is an over-indication of my ego, I felt slightly responsible. But I think that the hatred that has been levied against asylum seekers, immigrants, part of our society, is an indication that we are still utterly ready to acknowledge a level of hostility against the other. I think that the equality interventions over the last decade worked very hard to tell people what they mustn't say and mustn't do. And if I look at, for example, the middle-ranking police officers now who came in when Stephen Lawrence's inquiry was concluded, the Macpherson report, the Race Relations Amendment Act, there's a whole generation of bobbies who were told all the words they weren't allowed to say. They didn't really understand, fundamentally, that by working with different communities you are more effective at tackling crime and preventing crime. It became much more about a list of things you mustn't do. Now, criticising the Equality Act at a time when there are plenty of people who want to scrap it for bad reasons is strategically not a good move. So you won't hear Stonewall kind of talking about this publicly, but this isn't public, it's fine. But I do think that it's an indication that we haven't created a world where people are able to see beyond their own prejudice. I think we've created a world where people feel more anxious about expressing that prejudice. And what Brexit has done, and you see it on Facebook, and I read lots of different things that are anti-LGBT, and there is a real kind of outpouring of resentment about things that have happened, and I think we have to be very mindful of that.
Okay, over to the audience. Who wants to ask the first question? Oh, I hate awkward silences. I've got a whole list of questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, Kirsten Wiss. I'm the chair of the local ambulance service LGBT network, and also the deputy chair of the national ambulance diversity and LGBT network. My question is very much linked to what we're discussing there, and it's more specifically, you mentioned about the NHS and about how there's some endemic practices that go on. And my thought is around, we're currently looking at banter and the use of banter within the workplace, and almost the naivety of people thinking they can hide behind words or not use words. And I wondering where you're sort of coming from a Stonewall perspective as to how you tackle that, and obviously accepting the law of Equality Act, but actually how in practice does that actually come across?
I think there's a lot talked about banter, and often what's meant by banter is, I don't mean to be mean, and I love gay people, I do. It's just chat, and it's often a way of indicating what people's intentions are. And I think what we know is that language is hugely powerful. So in schools, for example, 98% of kids hear, "That's so gay, you're so gay, your trainers are so gay," continually. And when you are exploring your own identity, being told that gay is crap has an impact. So we know that language is powerful and language matters. And I think that one of the most important things about when we talk about banter is about people feeling overly policed. I think there's a real anxiety that they have to watch themselves too much. But I think it's about convincing individuals that the power they have and the language they use has an impact on the work they do and the outcomes they have. So at Stonewall, we generally not say, don't use that language. We say, you are creating an environment that is pretty horrible to work in for someone who's not out, or who is out and has to counteract it. The most powerful antidote to bants is heterosexual people. So when heterosexual people say, that computer's not gay, you sound a bit of an idiot, that is incredibly powerful. When it becomes down to the gay one, in the same way in racism, it's down to the one black person in the room to say, actually, you using that language is a little bit offensive, that's too much. If more heterosexual people say, actually, that's not really cool, that's not how we talk here. So that's why Stonewall places so much emphasis on the role of allies. Number one, because there are far more of them. Number two, it's better than leaving it to the one individual, the one LGBT person. It's incredibly exhausting to have to counteract what we call microaggressions all the time, with that kind of banter and language. And what we find is that heterosexual people, when they are empowered to do so, are amazing at it. I mean, I think that, to take a personal example, my mum, who went on a journey, let's say, so went on a journey. As soon as she kind of got her head around it, was the single biggest advocate for LGBT equality. And she was by the time she retired, Dean of Nursing and Midwifery at Cardiff University, Professor of Women's Health, and every new intake of students were told, turn to the person next to you, they might be your best friend, you might end up marrying them, or you might enter into a civil partnership. Cardiff University is fully committed to LGBT inclusion. Every single nursing midwife who goes through our programme will qualify with an utter commitment to inclusion, and we will not tolerate da, 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 da. And every nursing midwife who came out of Cardiff University was utterly committed to ensuring they would not discriminate in that. So it requires that top level allies making sure that they're setting the tone for this, rather than relying on the informal context of the individual to resist it all. And I think it does make a difference and it does have an impact. But I think generally what it's an indication of is people saying, don't overly police me. And that's to my point about the impact of the Equality Act, I think. It's a long answer, sorry.
Question. Just one in the middle and then one at the front.
I take your point that you're saying it's all about the main challenge is about changing mindsets now and not necessarily policy. Still, if you could put, say, 3 pieces of legislation through just like that, what would you go for?
I would go for a reform of the Gender Recognition Act, pretty urgently. So our trans legislation is really outdated, really old school. It requires an individual to have a diagnosis of something called gender dysphoria, which is a mental health issue. They have to then live in role for 2 years, even when they might be exposed to incredible hostility. They then have to prove that they're man enough or woman enough, as determined by someone who has their own notions of what it is to be man or woman enough, and then they have to go through numerous hoops and then be assessed by a panel who might decide they're not trans enough. I mean, it's barbaric and very expensive. So a good Gender Recognition Act reform would be important. Number 2, a reform of hate crime legislation. So disability and LGBT people still don't receive the same kind of attention around hate crime legislation as other protected characteristics, which is having a major impact on the terraces in football, and really affecting how that can be prosecuted when that happens in that space. The third bit of legislation, if I had to introduce legislation, would be around amending the Equality Act to incorporate gender identity rather than and gender expression rather than gender recognition. So gender recognition, at the moment the state only recognises one form of gender identity, so you can either be male or female. And there's a real big fuss that's come from America about trans women using bathrooms and trans men using bathrooms. The reality is that somebody who looks like me is more likely to get flack for using the wrong bathroom. Lots of trans women use women's bathrooms and have been using women's bathrooms all their life without upsetting anyone. My partner, who's much more slender than me, got called out by a group of children the other day in a bathroom and was told that they were going to tell the teacher because he was in the wrong toilet, and they called her a sex offender, because it couldn't countenance that a woman with short hair wearing a shirt tucked into her jeans and looking very Shoreditch could possibly be a woman. So there's something about how we make provision for the variance of gender presentation and how we protect people in that situation that is incredibly important. My optimism about getting the first and third of those legislative changes through in the current climate is pretty low, if I'm honest. I think we are making more progress on trans equality through corporations than we are through Westminster. So when Barclays introduces MX onto a credit card, that is incredibly powerful when the passport authorities are still debating whether a third gender can exist. So our change model's turned on its head. So it used to be the case you change the law and then the world changes. Now it's IBM changes something and society follows. And that's a really interesting position to be in when the corporations are the social voice and Unilever is the biggest and most effective NGO in the world. Interesting times.
There's a question at the front. Can you just bring the microphone forward?
One of the things that particularly troubled me coming out of the United States is that it seems fairly clear that quite a few of Trump's supporters are working class white people who are feeling we've been told be ignored by the Democrats, but told what to say, what to think. They're imposing their values, and I think there's perhaps quite a bit of that in the atmosphere here as well. How do you cope with that?
Well, by realising it doesn't work. So the thing that's interesting about America, and there's a huge amount speculated about why what's happened in America has happened. My theory is, for what it's worth, as someone who's not American, is that despite Obama being utterly amazing, obviously, and all the things that we as a nation think, he didn't tackle economic inequalities. He didn't think about jobs in the same way. And I think the way he approached transgender law reform was an indication of his approach, which was he enforced that legislation at state level. So he thrust that upon people. And at Stonewall we've always known thrusting equalities legislation upon someone never works. There's just a pushback from it. It has to come from the people, which is why we were scared about marriage, if I'm honest. It was imposed on. And what Trump says is, what you see is what you get, and I care about you. And that is music to people's ears. And I think that there is an authenticity to him that is deeply troubling for us as people who are interested in equality issues, but it is resonating. I think the issue that we have in Britain is that, to simplify something that's very complicated, I think the left talk about economic equalities without realising that identity and equalities is key to that. You cannot achieve economic equalities without tackling racism. So they talk about socialism purely through the prism of economic inequalities and eradicating economic inequalities. But unless you contend and recognise that a black man is less likely to get a job than a white man, you're not going to achieve your socialist ideal. So there's been a separation of that in a way that isn't particularly helpful, and that means it will fall down. Whereas the right is very concerned about individual rights to succeed and do what they need to do, and that's the small social state. We know that that's the key, and that is equally excluding. So there's been an emerging narrative about having an identity and an otherness somehow puts you in a privileged position, and that's a really dangerous position to get into in Britain. So we assume that if you have an identity and an otherness, that gives you a power, and in fact, what we need to express is how that diminishes your power, and that you're part of that individual mass movement. In terms of how Stonewall influences those who are fundamentally prejudiced, but are doing their own thing, it is through knowing LGBT people. We know that when people know their family or their friends or their congregation who are LGBT, attitudes change. And sometimes that leads to a bit of cognitive dissonance. You know, you might end up saying, I fundamentally believe that same-sex orientation is a first-order issue and St. Paul wants you to be celibate, but I love that my grandson's got a boyfriend. You know, you hold those two positions, and we see it more and more, these two positions being held. And you love your grandson and your boyfriend, but you also firmly believe in the first order issue of St. Paul and celibacy. And that contradiction is really existing in communities quite a lot, and that doesn't worry me too much. I think the kind of holding on to fundamental beliefs but treating people well is a good outcome than bullying this person to abandon their belief in the first order principle. Which is why I was disappointed when Tim Farron felt obliged to say, I don't think gay sex is a sin. I think that's his own business. I think I would rather he would just say, I'm an evangelical, everything's a sin. Let me get on with my business. And instead he felt kind of badgered into saying something that would make us all feel better. And actually that's not helpful in any of this discourse, I don't think. Knowing gay people.
Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and it was really helpful. But I'm struggling to understand part of how you see the past and the future at Stonewall as being different.
Yeah.
Describe the past as being quite clean, quite white, quite literate, and I get that, and I think that has resulted in some important incremental change. But then you describe the future as being working with companies and working in a very corporate sort of way, it seemed to me, which also sounded quite clean and quite white and quite literate. Where is this radical agenda? What does it really look like?
Well, I would never use the word radical, because Stonewall continues to be a pragmatic, non-democratic organisation that works on a nudge basis. I think the big difference is that when Stonewall was working for legislative change, it was about building cross-party support in a very safe way. I think it was about making sure that the agenda wasn't too complicated. I think what's changing and has changed is who holds the power now. So corporates hold most of the ability to influence and change society, and certainly internationally, I would say. So how do we get them to talk well about trans issues in Africa when we've basically educated them over the last 10 years that gay men from Oxford should have a job too? And it's that challenge for Stonewall, how we can broaden those who hold the power to think differently about what our community needs and looks like. Alongside that, it is about sharing Stonewall's power and giving away stuff. So Stonewall is redesigning the table, for want of a better word. So lots of organisations, when they say they want to be less as they were, put a chair around the table and invite someone black around it. What Stonewall's trying to do is fundamentally rethink what we're about. That means that our staff, for example, are absolutely connected with the mission in a way that hasn't really been the case before. So Stonewall is in and of itself a social movement. So the 120 staff constantly think about power and how to influence and how to change and how to influence other people and how to share that power. We try and live the values we espouse externally. Practically speaking, it means that we run many more programmes for want of a better word, hard to reach communities. So all our work with faith schools, for example, we deliver for free. So we work with 2,000 schools. Any faith school that wants to work with us immediately gets to the top of the queue and gets free access. We train LGBT people of faith from all faiths to go and talk about their experiences. We work with imams who are heterosexual and teach them and talk to them about how they can talk about sexual orientation and gender identity more effectively. Part of that is about not talking about that so much. So not taking the credit for that, not kind of, we don't go into Muslim schools, we train LGBT Muslims to go into Muslim schools. And that means that they get the brand credit, they get the money, they get the recognition, and Stonewall is far behind that. And it's really about Stonewall letting go a little bit about some of these interventions and not being quite so controlling of it. And I think for me that the trans work indicated a willingness to work in a different way and find different ways of bringing communities together. If you look at our work with the disabled community, that really is about making sure that LGBT people who are disabled are defining their own policy interventions. What is it they want local authorities to be doing around disability and LGBT people, rather than Stonewall being the only person speaking in that way. So it's about making sure that we've got more people having those conversations, rather than presenting a very sanitised view of what it is to be LGBT that is going to be convincing and safe. Now, some of that we have to do anyway. When I'm talking to the Premier League, I do not talk about Foucault, intersectional identity and its impact on emerging senses of self. I talk about how calling someone a puff is going to make them not score a goal. You know, there is a little bit still about matching an audience, but I feel very conscious when I'm in that space, and I know our staff do too, when we're slightly kind of doing entry-level stuff onto gay rights, how much we're missing out. And I think that that's a different level of awareness for Stonewall about how we can use our power to sometimes have unpalatable conversations about things that are complicated. And that means with our own supporters too. And that's an evolving idea. But I think that what we're trying to articulate is that there is a need for a different kind of social movement now. The way in which people engage with change is changing. And I interviewed for campaign directors for another charity the other day, and they all said, well, Twitter's the best way of reaching hard communities. It's like, no, Twitter is the best way of reaching a bunch of kids who basically don't look beyond Twitter. I mean, that is not the key to a social movement. So how do we get people involved and how do we empower them is fundamental. So in summary, it is much more about empowering individuals to be the change themselves, rather than Stonewall imposing a very strict and clean narrative about what that looks like. And if that means the 36 kids we train in Birmingham want to do a campaign on bisexual Wales, I kind of have to be all right about that, even if it's not our key priority. So I would rather they did a campaign on rainbow laces, getting kids involved in homophobia in sport. They want to do something on making sure that knitting classes are accessible to queer people. It's like, all right, you know, so part of Stowe was letting go of some of that stuff and let people run their own change internally. So it's a journey, and Stonewall's not always going to get that right by any means, but it has required a different way of thinking.
Hi, you spoke about how Stonewall pushed like the good gay image which was strategic at the time, to get lobbying through the government and legislation through. Seemed like the best option, but potentially disillusioned to some of the community. Looking back now, do you think there's anything that you would have done differently or could have done in a different way?
Well, yeah, there's lots. And I wasn't in charge, so. But I do sometimes reflect whether I would have been chief exec in 2004-05, whether someone like me could have been chief exec in 2005, whether basically a Butch Dyke would have been all right in that context of persuading a lot of very different politicians to go for equal age of consent. And there's a little bit of imposter syndrome, self-doubt, female rejection and all that, right? So you, me and my therapist can talk about that. But there is something about, was that worth it for what was gained? And it's very difficult for me to objectively reflect on that. Now, had I had the power I have now, would I have been more assertive about being more imaginative about how we talk about inclusion? Would I have been encouraging Stonewall to relax a little bit about some of our brand and our boundaries and things like that? But Stonewall was competing in a tough field. There was a lot of hostility and remains a lot of hostility about what we do. We get reported to the Charity Commission once a week by far-right Christian organisations who are suggesting that we're outside our remit. So I have to spend about 2 hours a week constructing defences about why we're doing okay. You know, so that there are attacks against what we do, and I still believe we have to bring as many people with us as possible. However, I think we could have been braver about some of our challenges, and I think that when we when we were so conscious of the Daily Mail, I think we could have relaxed a little about that sometimes. But I do think that history will have to reflect on what was lost in that and what was gained by that, and I think it's hard for me to do so. But I wouldn't be Chief Executive of Stonewall now if I didn't have the board's buy-in to change things. So when I interviewed for Chief Exec, I said we have to resolve what we're doing about trans, and that might mean that we have to apologise, and that means we have to take a different approach. And I said, if you're not up for that, if you want nice, clean gay for another decade, then I am not your woman, frankly. And here I am.
Last question at the back, if we might.
Hi, you talk a lot about decentralizing power, but then you talk about engaging corporations, which are very top-down, centralized organizations. How do you reckon you can resolve that one?
It's difficult, but I think that Stonewall doesn't have the power to destroy capitalism. So we have to use the institutions that are available to us, and I believe that. I think corporations work in a very centralised power model, and I think that that's the way they operate. But in a way, the way in which they utilise that power at the moment is incredibly interesting. I think that the corporations in America have the power to influence Trump in a way that the activists don't. And I think the chief execs of the corporations who are serving at the pleasure of the president have a way of influencing that. Now, we can either kind of go, we believe in the destruction of capitalism and the destruction of the neoliberal state, so I will not work with corporations, but until such a time that we rise up against the machine and have a revolution in Britain, which won't happen until we stop providing cheap food, I'm going to work with what we can. And I do believe that these organisations are massive employers. They have a huge number of staff. I know that the work we do with their heterosexual staff have impacts on generations to come and generations through society. So I don't find it unpalatable at all. In the same way I don't find it unpalatable to work with the security services. I believe the security services who work to keep the country safe can also make the country safer. And if they are better at understanding LGBT inclusion in Muslim communities, then who knows what we might achieve. So I'm afraid I'm a very relaxed pragmatist when it comes to social change, and I believe that all the organisations and agencies involved in that should be part of making that happen.
Well, we've had a very wide-ranging conversation to follow this excellent lecture, and I think there's much there for us to consider and debate long after this first inaugural Wolfenden lecture. Please show your appreciation to them.